all the trees that pre-existed this area were dead and leafless, and it just looked like a
Wow.
miniature La Brea tar pits. But we didn't think much of it. We didn't really think much of it. Um, that was really striking. One was the surprising deliciousness of Cascara, and then the surprising visual of this incredible wasteland that was being developed. So when we launched Riff, we bringing that craft sensibility to the cold brew coffee space was what we were all about, and of course, being taking from the spirit of craft beer, innovation was one of our cornerstones.
This is Evolve CPG, a community of purpose driven brand leaders who not only believe in better, but actively pursue it. That's better products, better brands, and better leadership for a better world. You can join our online community right now where we're going further, faster together at community.evolvecpg.com. Join us. I'm your host, Gage Mitchell, founder and creative director of Modern Species, a sustainable brand design agency helping better brands grow and scale their impact. Since the day we launched, we've been lucky enough to book some amazing guests on our show. Now, as we inch closer to 100 episodes, we thought we'd take a moment to replay some of our top hits from 2021 to remind you all to dig back in the archives from time to time because there's a lot of wisdom just waiting for you to tune in. On today's episode, we're speaking with Paul Evers, CEO and co-founder of Riff, about his passion for craft beverages and coffee's dirty, not so little secret.
Hi, I'm Paul Evers, co-founder and CEO of Riff.
Nice. Thanks for joining us, Paul. I'm excited. Tried some of the products, thought they were delicious, but chatted with you a little bit to learn more about your background before this conversation. And I think as a fellow person coming from a creative background, I was really intrigued by your previous experience before launching your own brands. You helped other people launch a lot of brands or helped on the consulting side. So before we dive into what you're working on now, can you tell us a little bit about your career background and helping other brands grow?
Yeah, my background really is in creative services. I'm a creative guy, actually. So on the creative side of creative services, my career history is really in graphic design, art direction. But I would say, underlying that, my ethos is really oriented around relationships, and so that's really driven a lot of my career path and what my interests are. I really
Nice.
see brands actually as being the conduit that connects. Brand is a very that's really a kind of a pretty obtuse concept. What is a brand? But we know it's not simply a logo or an identity or a package design. It's really the ethos of the brand, and that's really about making connections and building relationships. So that's been more the philosophical approach that I've taken to creative services and helping companies build more vibrant relationships with their fans, is the way I like to put it. So,
Nice.
long career in creative services, working for others in the agency business, working in-house, coming from tech, then migrating over to in Bend. I live in Bend now. We moved up to Bend in 1990 from Southern California, and so in Bend, when you're in creative services, it's going to be you're going to work on a pretty broad range of sectors with a heavy load of tourism, uh, a little bit of CPG, and some banking and other service industries like that.
Nice. And I know that eventually your career came to kind of focus a little bit around beverage brands. So how did how did that transition happen from those days in Bend doing a little bit of everything to kind of having a more of a hyper focus?
Well, in Bend, was back then it was a fairly small town when I was working in creative services. And so, one of the things I realized after a few months of working for this other agency is that I had the only job that was a perfect match for my capabilities, skill set, and where I was at in my career path. And so, started looking at other communities, more metropolitan areas for potential careers, and just because we love Bend so much, turned those things down, which led then to exploring launching a new agency with some friends. And so that's what we did. So we ended up we were working a lot in tourism, resort, in a lot of different the same sectors that was working in previously, but really was drawn to packaging actually, because that's a really tangible expression of the brand. It is the primary touch point for consumers. I really didn't have a background in packaging. None of us really did, but we were really drawn to it. So we started going after and really trying to find a, a client that would give us the opportunity to develop the brand via packaging. And so our first project was with a small craft distillery here. This is in the late
Mm-hmm.
90s. And we were able to work on a gin brand that was made with natural ingredients and hand-picked juniper
Nice.
berries. And so that really was, rich with content and storytelling. And that was very successful. So that was really just going based on intuition and realizing that we could have, more noticeable, uh, more noticeable and quantifiable impact on brands' ability to connect with consumers by working on packaging. So this brand, for instance, I think it was selling for about $20 a bottle with the rebranding on the packaging and a lot of different touches that we implemented. And we were very experimental. We did a lot of crazy things with that label and leveraged a lot of sort of manual labor, which wears out over time to create super special feeling like each individual bottle was hand bottled, which
Nice.
it was. But it then commanded a premium price point of $30, and so that's material. So we said, wow, the work that we're doing is actually helping that client increase the retail price of their product by 50%, which is significant.
Yeah.
So that kind of solidified an attraction to CPG, and that work, in fact, led amongst some of the other work that we were doing, led to the opportunity to work with the Deschutes Brewery in a complete rebrand. Back in those days of craft beer, the differentiator for craft beer oftentimes was a little bit more of a less sophisticated approach to packaging or design or branding, and kind of look more homegrown was more the key and what really differentiated craft beer from the large beer brands. So we got the opportunity to work with the Shoots, and again, it was just intuition leading us, and we did a complete restage of their packaging and of their identity, and that was in March of this one year. And prior to that, they were flat or in some cases declining with some of their SKUs. And when we relaunched the brand, they realized at the end of the year a growth rate of 18%. So it was another validator. Like, we have some really good intuition, I think, into how to convey or how to articulate a craft sensibility, sense of humanity in packaging that resonates with consumers.
That's awesome.
So that's what really kind of solidified our passion around what we categorize as craft beverage.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, and I imagine we could geek out on that for an entire episode, being a food enthusiast and a designer of packaging myself.
Yeah.
But I want to get to some of your other projects, so we'll move forward. So I know that you also, through your specialty in craft beverages, you obviously gained a lot of experience. Like you said, you had good intuition, you knew how to market them, but eventually you jumped to the launching your own company side with Crux, I think that was the first brand you launched on your own. So tell us a little bit about how that came to be and some lessons learned that you carried from your creative services side into launching your own brand.
Well, I would say Crux was born out of three different primary factors. One was we were doing a lot of work in craft beer. We had been working with Odell Brewing out of Fort Collins, 21st Amendment Brewery out of San Francisco, as well as some NA craft brands like Hum Kombucha. At that time, they were Kombucha Mama. So real, that passion is what is the key ingredient in launching any kind of craft brand, particularly craft beer. So there was there's a lot of emotional benefit and emotional satisfaction with developing a brand that creates this kind of the overall vibe of a craft beer brand. So that's what really drove that. Craft beer brands, the way that I saw it at that point is that they were engaging their fans in relationships that elevated significantly above a transactional relationship. We're not now manufacturers and consumers. We're basically co-opting the brand, inviting a tribe, a set of fans. I hate the
Yeah.
term consumers because that just belittles our primary contributors to just consuming products. I've always hated that term. But inviting people in to where they feel like they have a sense of ownership. In fact, they're wanting those brands that they support, those craft brands that they just support to be part of their own identity. So they're wearing the merch, they're wearing the hats, the shirts, and they're proud to have that sense of affiliation, even though they don't own any equity in that. So I was really drawn to being a part of sort of an operator in that equation, not just the sort of the facilitator of that relationship, but being on the operations side. The other part is that in our work with craft beverage brands, and I'm sorry to backtrack a little bit, but we had started employing research, consumer insight into really understanding how to articulate a brand in a way that is powerful, meaningful, resonates with the consumers. And we were using more ethnographic and anthropological methodologies, working with a researcher. This brought incredible insight. It's just like, if you're in a relationship and you're having troubles or challenges communicating or being on the same page, it's really a communication challenge, right? Listening and then also speaking from an authentic point of view in a way that's respectful. It's the same, I think rules of play that can be applied to a brand and building a relationship with your audience. So we understood where consumers, we had I guess I would say an inside track on understanding what consumers were really interested in, and then understanding how to build a brand that was based on authentic passion and communicate that brand in a way that was meaningful to the consumer, the customers, the fans. And then the other is just building relationships with those in the craft beer industry, really trusted relationships. So ended up, working on a concept in early 2007 with a really good friend from the craft beer space, talking about a concept of just seeing the trend now back in that time of consumers wanting to explore and a real
Mm-hmm.
draw to more complex barrel-aged beers. And so the idea initially was really around building a brewery that was based on low volume and high margin and just rich experiences. So we wanted to have a tasting room that provided an opportunity to really engage with the brewery. So that ended up becoming Crux Fermentation Project, which opened in June of 2012 in Bend, Oregon. And I could go on and tell the story of that, the story of failure and then success, and prototyping and iteration. And we ended up with an incredible location in Bend. It's basically a former Amco transmission plant that
Huh.
we stumbled upon. Well, everybody knew where this Amco was, but nobody knew how to get to it. We say the name Crux was really born of something that was really an authentic part of the origin of that place, and that is, it was in the crossroads of the town of Bend where the four quadrants
Nice.
met, north, south, east, and west, is at the crux of Bend. And then a little bit elevated, provided a beautiful panoramic view. And we did everything we could to eliminate the barrier between a customer and the actual operating brewery. And I think we did a really beautiful job, in just satisfying all the regulatory from, federal with TTB to state and local, and then permitting, building codes, et cetera. So when you go there, you can actually, you can sit pretty close to the brew house and smell, the spent grain as it's being pulled from the lauter tun. You can smell the whole leaf hops as they're being placed into the hop back, and The beer is actually drawn from um, what are called bright tanks, but we use them as serving tanks. So you can't get beer any fresher than what you can get at Crux. So that was all about creating an incredible, rich experience for consumers, and then figuring out how to translate that out into the retail environment at the same time, but really provide a tangible, rich environmental experience at the tasting room.
Wow, as a craft beer nerd, that sounds amazing. 'Cause I'm one of those beer nerds that's kind of, I like a good IPA occasionally, but this whole movement of everything is IPA all the time, especially in the Northwest, is frustrating because I love a beer experience. One of my favorite things about craft beer is the variety of different types of beer and different thing inclusions you can put in there and different ways you can bring it to life through different types of fermentation. And there's just so much richness to it that every brewery I go to, I just get like a sampler, just because I want to see all the different things they're doing. So to dive deeper into that experience through Crux sounds amazing. So nice work on that.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you. Yeah, it is amazing. So, one of the things I love about craft beer is that prior to craft beer, so you take brands like Sierra Nevada, others that were really pioneers in the space, people, in the U.S. understood beer as being a Pilsner, whether it's Bud, Miller, Coors, but we didn't have an understanding of the breadth and the opportunity for creativity and exploration that was available in beer until the craft category basically revitalized more traditional Belgian brewing methods or German, and then added, a whole new level to that just with a spirit of entrepreneurialism and creativity here in the U.S. It's just, if you condense that history of what happened from big beer to craft beer being the predominant players in the space, from my perspective at least, it's pretty dramatic what happened. And so those were game changers, those pioneers in the brewing industry. And it really, I think, I see craft beer as being the lead horse or the big tanker for such a small category, really paving the way in the migration and kind of creating this wake that other craft sectors could then follow along that caused uh, caused Americans to trust their neighbor more than large manufacturers. I grew up in an era where TV dinners were introduced, and so mass production of food products. I think we are led
Yeah.
to believe that that's who you trust most. That they must have the QA programs and protocol all locked down, and it turns out that they've been betraying us for decades. And really, it's your neighbor down the street who you can trust most. And so that really led the way, I think, to help consumers trust smaller brands, regional brands, and really pave the way for a broad range of innovation and new product introductions in the U.S.
Yeah, well, I'm appreciative of that trend because I love all the experimental, all the small batch, all the whatever. Because as soon as things go super mainstream, more often than not, they get really watered down because they're just trying to find the lowest common denominator, of like the flavor or the
Yeah.
taste that people will like in order to push it out further. But those more craft experiments can be take more risks, because they're working in small batch.
Yes. Right. That's right. That's exactly right. So yeah, the risk
Yeah.
is minimal. And if when we started Crux, I think one of the things that we agreed to is that we would celebrate the first time we had to destroy a batch of beer.
Nice.
That you want to adopt this mentality that we're prototyping, we're iterating, learning, iterate, test, learn, um, and not be afraid to failure. In fact, not be afraid to fail. I mean, in fact, embrace it and fail harder, faster, because it's about in pursuit of the next thing that we're not yet aware of.
That's a beautiful philosophy. Now, it's clear that you bring a lot of like passion and curiosity to all the projects you work on. And as we kind of start shifting the conversation into your more recent brand that you launched, I'd love to hear how, you know, obviously you have all this passion for the craft beer and alcohol and other beverage kind of industry, but then Your newest product is coffee, which, can be craft as well, of course, we've learned over time. But how did coffee bubble up on your consciousness and, push you to decide to launch another brand in that space?
Well, this is only the second conversation I've had with you, and you just kind of nailed me. You said, I know that you've demonstrated a lot of passion for beer and alcohol. That's right. That's very true.
Yep.
Well, I think, going back to the craft beer experience, what really drove that for me is just the resetting of the kind of relationship that a brand can have with its consumers. And what I like to say is the maker of the thing and the lover of the thing, and removing as many barriers in between those two parties to have a really vibrant relationship. That's what craft beer did for me. So um, I decided, so I had been involved in day-to-day operations at Crux for 5 years, and I have a very strong partner, Larry Sador, who is a very well-respected brewmaster in the craft beer space, and decided that I was ready to move on. I understood, I kind of really fully realized, coming from creative services where you're working on a broad range of sectors and you're working on a variety of brands. One of the things that I love about that whole thing and being in creative services is that because of that variety and you're learning about all these different categories, it was really satisfying my desire to be a lifelong learner. You're always learning something new as you're getting into, diving deeper into understanding your clients' businesses. And so I was really getting in touch with the sense that, what I really love to do is build things. I'm not necessarily the best person to be the ongoing operator once a brand has reached a sort of a level of maturity or a plateau. So I decided to leave day-to-day operations at Crux and then to start venturing into something new. And I talked to a lot of people in the industry, people who were, are pillars in the craft beer space and in beverage overall, and asking what the most exciting categories are, to get involved with right now. I was interested at that point in getting into non-alc. I was really interested in learning what that other side of the regulatory wall
Yeah.
was and how that worked, to learn about that. I was also, had a sense of satisfaction that was involved in the launch of a craft beer brand. So balancing that out with non-alc seemed to make sense for me. And so the two categories that came up over and over again from people that I trusted in the industry were kombucha and cold brewed coffee. I started looking into coffee, and at that point, I saw some trends within coffee that, to me, were an indicator that uh, the opportunity in coffee might be similar to that was happening in beer about a decade prior, and that was coffee consumption was declining slightly, 1 or 2 percentage points a year, um, with hot coffee. Hot brewed coffee was declining, but cold brewed coffee was growing at a pretty significant rate. And then the more and more I started learning about cold brewed coffee, I really started to understand and interpret that and see the possibility that that could be the cold brew sector could be the disruptor in the coffee space. The last, material sort of transcending event that we had in coffee was really Starbucks popularizing the traditional
Hmm.
Italian ways of preparing coffee. And if you go pre-Starbucks, making that available across the country, across the globe, really the way that people enjoyed coffee was either out of a can, with grounds out of a can, or freeze dried coffee or diner coffee. But coffee was not a very elevated experience. It was more something like $1 a cup in a diner. And then Starbucks just revolutionized coffee in creating what they call this third place between home and work and a place to hang out. So we were seeing a new opportunity with cold brewed coffee. What we love about cold brewed coffee is it's less acidic, it's less bitter. It really allows us natural, amazing. Coffee has an amazing flavor wheel, by the way, with dried fruits and floral and citrusy. beyond what you would expect with chocolate and nutty and roasted, and allows those flavors to shine through because when coffee was introduced into this country, it was really a lower grade Robusta coffee. And I couldn't imagine launching an entire category by saying, we understand it doesn't taste that great, but if you balance out the bitterness with some dairy the bitterness with some sweetener and the acidity with dairy, then you got a really great drink. So just buy these other two ingredients along with your coffee. And that's how, I grew up in that coffee space because the quality of coffee when I was growing up was not that great. And so then we were seeing, imagining an opportunity to bring the craft sensibility over into cold brewed coffee and to create an experience and reintroduce coffee or restate what the relationship with coffee could be through cold brew with a commitment to innovation and exploration. And so that's been an interesting path that we've embarked on that actually has taken us to places that we had never imagined or dreamed of.
Nice. I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but a lot of this conversation around coffee and alcohol and kombucha is reminding me of a book. I think it's called like Drink or the History of Drink or something. And it talks about all the different, the world's most popular beverages and the origins, where they came from and how they grew in popularity and so on and so forth. But if you haven't checked that out, you should read that book. Wow. Super interesting, especially for someone in your shoes.
Well, as soon as I get out of this, that's exactly what I'm going to be looking for, because that is the book I've been searching for. So thank you.
Yeah, it's if I remember correctly, it's a pretty thick book too, but just super fascinating. Hey y'all, we're going to take a quick break to let you know about a new podcast called Climify for designers, educators, and sustainability geeks.
Host and design educator Eric Benson interviews acclaimed climate scientists and sustainability experts to find out how designers can help combat the climate crisis in their college classrooms. The discussions on this program are geared to help you climify your syllabi to assign projects that not only teach design fundamentals, but also can have a positive impact on our climate. You can find Climify on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to join the conversation and become a climate designer, you can follow the show on Instagram at Climify Podcast, or head over to our great teaching resources at climatedesigners.org/edu.
All right, now let's get back to our conversation. So as you dove into coffee, obviously you're a very curious person, which is great for being a creative service provider and an entrepreneur. But in our previous conversation, what struck me is that you kind of, through your curiosity and through learning more and more about coffee, you discovered what you call this dirty, not so little secret within the coffee industry. And that kind of led you to a new product kind of category that you've launched. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that dirty, not so little secret?
That's my favorite story to tell. So great. Coffee's been around for about 400 years, and the story of how coffee became one of the world's largest agriculturally traded commodities is really fascinating. The origins in Yemen and East Africa, and it's just fascinating. So it's been around so long. We've all grown up with it. It's sort of like you become desensitized to even thinking about beyond what coffee's like, except for a bag of ground coffee or whole bean coffee that you grind and then you brew, and we're just not really thinking beyond that. And when we started, we were getting ready to launch. We were in the planning phases for Riff. One of my co-founders is Bobby Evers, who is related. He's my son. We decided to take a trip down to Colombia and spend a couple of weeks with coffee farmers just to really understand. Coffee is a new category for us, so we wanted to learn and wanted to really have a good understanding of what it was like to grow coffee. How is coffee cultivated, harvested, processed, and prepared for export? What were the living conditions for coffee farmers? What was it like for them? What were the requirements for growing coffee, et cetera, all those idiosyncrasies. And so we spent 2 weeks down in Colombia in early 2017. and toured about a half a dozen coffee farms and experienced it firsthand. Being new to this space, I hadn't really thought about this, about, coffee being a fruit. Um, I knew that there was like a red berry that the coffee plant produced, and that coffee beans were inside that red berry. And I had seen that before, but I didn't really, apply much thought to it or analysis or curiosity. And so when we were down there, we, spent a time with coffee farmers. We actually were hosted by coffee farmers for meals, and they're very, very simple uh, homes, with dirt floors and walls made out of bamboo. These people were so wonderful and generous, and offered such incredible warm hospitality. Then they'd walk us through their fields, and we would pull ripe coffee berries, or coffee cherries, whatever you want to call them. Coffee has a lot of confusing
Yeah.
terminology, by the way. And extract the pit, which is, the two-headed seed, which is a coffee bean, and then actually experience the flavors and the sensory of what that fruit is like around the coffee bean. And it was really surprising and mind-blowing to us. Really, a very prominent natural sweetness. There's a bit of starchiness to it, but really, what I got out of the one, one of the few cherries that I tried down there, along with Bobby, was really strong notes of apple and other fruits that were very familiar, apricot, some stone fruit, and it was very complex, very new, but also really, really wonderful. But we didn't think much of it, and we were also shown, an area that was the back corner of a plantation, where they've been discarding. This one particular farm had been discarding their cascara because it's a byproduct with no demand. We didn't have much of an understanding of what it was and its possibilities back then. So they'd been discarding, this one farm discarding the cascara into this back corner of their plantation, and all the trees that pre-existed this area were dead and leafless, and it just looked like a
Wow.
miniature La Brea tar pits. But we didn't think much of it. We didn't really think much of it. Um, that was really striking. One was the surprising deliciousness of Cascara, and then the surprising visual of this incredible wasteland that was being developed. So when we launched Riff, bringing that craft sensibility to the cold brewed coffee space was what we were all about. And of course, being, taking from the spirit of craft beer, innovation was one of our cornerstones. So we began experimenting in 2019 with Cascara and converting Cascara into a beverage that would complement our cold brewed coffee line. And so our other co-founder, Nate Armbrust, who comes to us from Stumptown, he had been with Stumptown for 5 or so years, actually helped them grow that business from benchtop brewing in cafes to packaged product for national distribution. He's actually the guy who came up with the idea
Nice.
of nitrogenating cold brew coffee for nitro cold brew, which is now being offered across the U.S. And Starbucks has their own. It's offered in all 14,000 of their cafes across the U.S. So we started experimenting with Cascara, and traditionally, Cascara was a pretty small segment. Most people are not aware of Cascara, and it traditionally had been presented as a kind of a still tea in a glass bottle. So kind of like an iced tea that you might pour over ice. That was the product form. And we wanted to do something different. We were surprised by, again, the flavor profile, and it has a natural tartness and sweetness, and the stone fruit flavor notes. And so we landed on, let's try something that's carbonated. And so as we were working through that, started thinking about just our natural curiosity. Started thinking about, we saw one coffee farm and what they did with the Cascara, but looking at the statistics that, as much much as 25 billion pounds of dried whole bean green coffee is staged for export on an annual basis. What's happening with all that cascara? And so what we had heard is that traditionally it's composted and converted to fertilizer. And so, well, that's good. That's good. So then it's, helping, the coffee farmers be have a higher yield and better product, et cetera. But then we started thinking a little bit deeper into the magnitude. So I'm not a coffee expert. I built a spreadsheet talking to other people on our team, talking to key stakeholders, relationships that we had in coffee, and just was kind of directed and led to look at the anatomy of the coffee cherry on the plant and break all the different components down by weight. And so we learned that the coffee bean, the two-headed seed, makes up about 20% of the total weight of a coffee cherry. And that cascara actually makes up about 65% of the total weight of the coffee cherry at the time of harvest. The balance would be all the various layers like skin and parchment, et cetera, the layers separating the different parts. And then we started thinking, man, there's a lot more cascara than anybody that we did, a lot more than than what we had imagined or thought. So started reaching out to trade groups, talking about, asking about what their estimates are with the magnitude of cascara that's produced and what's being done with it, and how is it being used. And we're not getting much information, not getting calls back. The common response would be, I'll reach out to somebody in that category, but somebody will get back to you. And I never get a return call and make another call. And so we started becoming very, very suspicious that this was a large problem that people were very uncomfortable talking about. And so it took a lot of work, but we got the attention of a senior climate change scientist at Oregon State University and sat down over coffee. This was pre-pandemic in late 2019, and said, we want to work with you on a study estimating the magnitude of cascara that's produced, the magnitude of waste, and what its impact is on the environment, because we're suspicious that it's significant. Doing our own calculations, we had some significant estimates, and then some peers in the space actually were doing work in cascara had their own estimates. So we launched a robust study with Oregon State University, supervised by the senior climate change scientist, Dr. Dominique Bachelet, and the study was conducted by a PhD student. And a few months later, so in the summer of 2020, the results of the study basically validated that we had every reason to be suspicious, because the estimates were far greater than what other people were aware of or claiming. And that is as much as, and I believe this to be a conservative estimate, with 25 billion pounds of green coffee harvested and processed for export,
Wow.
is about the equivalent of 100 billion pounds of cascara produced as a byproduct. 70%, this conservative estimate, is literally thrown to waste, 70% of that. So the 30%, yes, is some is converted to fertilizer through composting, some is used as animal feed, and some is translated into biofuel. But 70 billion pounds was as I said, a conservative estimate on what was being thrown to waste. There are three main ways of actually, I guess, processing the waste. One is dumping it into the back corner of coffee plantations, like I had previously described. Wow. In Mexico, the general practice is to just dump it into streams. And then, but the large portion of it is actually just hauled off to landfill, where it's literally piled into mountains. So when it's dumped into the back corners of the plantations, basically you have a fruit that's where the protective skin layer has been punctured because you've extracted the bean. And so that's just a rich environment for microbials and mycotoxins to develop. So What scientists are saying is in the back corners of plantations, it's developing mycotoxins, which are then seeping into soils and water tables and destroying the land for future agricultural use, which is exactly the scene that we saw firsthand. And when it's dumped into waterways, it's
Wow.
as it's decomposing, it's depleting the water of oxygen
Yeah.
and leading to the killing off of fish and other aquatic life. And then when it's piled in the mountains and landfill, I know it's astronomical, isn't it? So in when it's piled in landfills in mountains, it's as it's decomposing, it's producing methane gas to the equivalent of over 13 billion pounds of it's methane gas equivalent to over 13 billion pounds of carbon dioxide, which is the same emissions level of 3 million automobiles in a single year. So that's what we call coffee's dirty, not so little secret. And that is, nobody understands that
Yeah.
their, normal cup of Joe is actually contributing to the new normal of extreme weather events and floods and fires and what's happening to the planet. It's all that whole story is compounded by other really significant issues that are facing the coffee industry. For instance, coffee, 75 to 85% of coffee is actually grown by smallholder farmers, meaning independent family-owned farms. And about 80% of the total, those or 80% of that population is actually living in poverty because of historically low commodity pricing. So coffee farmers are unable to make a reliable living. Coffee is grown in a very narrow temperature window, and in the low 70s, high 60s, low 70s, and that temperature window needs to be fairly stable. That's why coffee is grown in the equatorial zone. So with rising temperatures, coffee farmers have no option but to go to higher elevations. That's the best way to make sure that they're growing coffee in the right temperature zone. And leading scientists today predict that as much as
Wow.
half of the existing land that's being used to grow coffee will no longer be viable because of rising temperatures by the year 2050. So the coffee industry as a whole has this very significant, sustainability risk moving forward. And the irony is that they're contributing to the greatest threat that's facing the coffee industry by wasting Cascara. So you got the environmental health, you've got the challenging economic situation for coffee farmers, and then the thing that makes this an even graver sin. I mean, all that's bad news, right? But what makes it an even graver sin is that we don't know about Cascara, and so hence there's no demand. And the truth of Cascara is that it's nutritionally rich. It's loaded with antioxidants. It's got potassium, rich in potassium and iron. And we suspect that it's arguably the better half of what the coffee plant has to offer. Yet because there's no awareness, there's no demand. And so, I mean, we
Yeah.
love coffee. We love coffee. I love coffee. I have coffee every morning as part of my morning ritual. Um, and then to know that there's this better half that's actually being thrown to waste because there's no awareness, that's awful. So why are we taking an agricultural byproduct that's nutritionally rich and can enhance the health and wellness of consumers and just throwing it away? So our whole purpose here is to translate Cascara into products that can benefit consumers. They I've seen a lot of papers written about comparing or classifying Cascara as a superfruit, comparing it to other superfruits like acai. And the Cascara puts the acai berry to shame. I mean, I'd say it establishes a whole new
Wow.
category. Like it's a superfruit. It's not just a superfruit; it's a super duper fruit, is what I'm saying.
Nice.
And
Yeah.
so, translating that to products that consumers can enjoy, injecting economic viability for coffee farmers. That, when consumers today are thinking about sustainability, they're not just thinking about the health of the planet, but they're also thinking about supply chain economics, economic equity. They're looking at social equity. How are these farmers being treated? Is it ethical? Is it fair? There was a story recently, I think on NPR, that was making the point that if we were to balance out supply chain economics to make sure that there's equity throughout the channel with coffee, that a cup of coffee in the U.S. should cost about $25 to
Oh
make
my
sure that
God.
coffee farmers are paid what they deserve. But by generating demand for Cascara, then we create economic value for that as a byproduct of the harvest. They can potentially double their revenue stream, double employment, and it injects economic viability. And then saving it from going to waste is, in service to the planet. So we're looking at a win across all those different silos. And then another issue is just the proliferation of plant disease, which seems to be fueled by rising temperatures. Some communities suspect that these waste piles of Cascara actually uh, the is what's generating the fungus that's leading to leaf rust,
Wow.
which is really interesting. There needs to be some more study on that. But when you think about these independent coffee farmers trying to grow coffee, they don't have reliable income as it is. They're having to deal with the proliferation of plant disease and the destruction of a certain percentage of their coffee plants. You're looking at the rising temperatures and the inability to grow coffee because of the temperature, the climate issues, and then all these things. Our contribution to this problem and solving it, which spans the entire chain, is to generate demand for Cascara.
You're definitely the first Cascara based food company I'm aware of, but I've also seen, companies solving similar problems with cacao. Like when cacao pods have a similar thing, they've got the seed inside, but there's all this fruit that normally goes to waste. And then I've, been seeing a lot of hemp advocates going out there talking about it's not just about the benefits of like CBD or other things like that, but the hemp fiber itself is incredibly valuable and can be used in construction materials or clothing or whatever else. So I'm just super fascinated. That's what I love about the upcycled kind of product movement, is that it's just about getting smarter with existing resources. Like there's all these problems that were caused because we got a little too hyper focused and didn't think about the whole system, and we just took the seed but threw the berry away. Like there's all these problems like that that then
Yeah.
rippled out
Yes.
and created so many terrible effects. But if we just go back to like trying to use the whole
Yeah.
thing, the whole animal, the whole plant, the whatever, and kind of respecting a little bit more about the value locked into all these different ingredients, attributes of a plant, different types of fiber, different nutrients, et cetera, then not only will we create more economic opportunities, but we'll be healthier and more sustainable and so on and so forth. It makes total sense.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's why, at Riff, our mission is to explore and celebrate 100% of the agricultural value of the coffee plant.
Nice.
And,
I love
when
it.
you have a legacy category like coffee, back 400 years ago, wasting some Cascara was not a big deal. But when you have it be, now that it's one of the largest traded agricultural commodities in the world, we're talking about something very, very, very significant that has a long legacy of practices. And so there's a lot to be done. And, I think, our whole approach to this is figuring out how to identify that perfect overlap of altruistic mission, and solving all these problems I just talked about and creating a win-win-win situation, overlapping that with an enterprise opportunity. And so we believe we've done that. And I've got a little can here of our Riff Energy Plus. We actually, because we're not going to be able to solve the problem unless we have scale. We need massive scale to actually contribute something meaningful to solving the problem. So we actually engage with college students up and down the West Coast on sensory, on brand messaging, what kind of functional benefit would be most attractive to them, and the brand positioning and the hierarchy, the messaging, all of that. And so we see this as being purpose built because we need to make sure that we're producing a product that is going to appeal to a mass audience. This is the beginning. We have 3 different flavors, but this is the very beginning of our work in Cascara. There's a lot more to be done, and there's a lot of different formats that we're looking at as far as translating Cascara into something that can benefit consumers. This is, the other thing with the Energy Plus is that we're not able to extract the entire nutritional value of Cascara. So there's a lot more R&D that we're doing and what we're imagining for ourselves in taking 100% of the nutritional value of Cascara and translating that into a beverage or a bar or some other kind of product.
That's beautiful. So I think you still have the cold brew as well, but this new line, just for clarity for those
Yes.
listening or watching, the newer line is a sparkling energy drink that's got a nice clean ingredient profile and kind of a bit of a fruity taste with it. So definitely go check out the website. We'll share links and everything in all the show notes if you're interested in those products. But and as you mentioned, I'm excited to hear about what's coming next with Cascara, because I think, like you said, there's so much potential for it. I appreciate your advocacy around bringing awareness around that as an ingredient and a functional ingredient at that. So I'm looking forward to see where you go next with that. But before we sign off on this, I'd love to, as someone who's helped launch and grow many brands for clients as creative services or even your own brands, and I'm curious to know, what's your most important piece of advice for other impact entrepreneurs and marketers?
Well, I think our egos tell us to be afraid of failure. That failure defines
Yeah.
failure. That you are a failure if you fail. But I think a great example is, I think Dyson actually did I don't know, something like 4,000 different iterations before he landed on the final prototype of the vacuum that has become so popular. We need to embrace. I think if you're a young brand and you're developing a plan, I think there's an attachment to demonstrating that you're successful and that you have insight and that you got it right by saying, kind of attaching yourself to this idea that you're going to develop a plan and it's going to be perfect and it's actually predictive of what the future holds. But embracing more of a malleable openness to, it's important to have a plan as a foundation, but making sure that you understand that the world is not static and is continually evolving, and you're going to have things happen to you that are very surprising, both on challenges and opportunities. Like for us in the Riff plan, we set out, we were wanting to build a really super cool cold brew coffee brand. Now what we understand ourselves to be is like, we want to be the premier coffee brand as a whole, and really utilizing the whole, everything that the coffee plant has to offer. So we kind of see ourselves as the next phase of what it means to be a coffee plant or a coffee brand. I'm sorry. So remaining open, and then not being afraid to fail, because failure is part and parcel with exploration, and so resiliency. The other thing that has really been substantial for us is really having clarity around our purpose. With a purpose oriented around solving these problems and exploring and celebrating 100% of the coffee plant's agricultural value in a way that's adding sustainability to the coffee industry itself, helping coffee farmers and translating something great to consumers. Then that elevates you above this, having a purpose that's around top line revenue or, gross profit, net profit, or satisfying investors, or making sure you look cool or whatever. But having a sense of purpose that is above and beyond and greater than yourself or your company, your brand, that really injects a significant amount of energy and drive, which puts you in a position to break down barriers rather than recognizing barriers as stopping points, because you're driven to break those barriers down. You understand that, you're venturing off into new territory. There's no roadmap. There's no assurance. There's no process that's already been established that'll get you through to success. So you have to carve that path yourself. You have to be an adventurer, an explorer.
I love that because I do think the entrepreneurial path is difficult, or just marketing an up and coming brand or anything. There's just, especially when it's mission driven, you've got so many more things on your plate to have to solve for and figure out and keep in mind, that having that purpose in mind, in your heart, and that's driving you forward, will get you through those tough patches where you're wondering if anything's working, or where you're kind of experiencing the ups and downs, or you're getting stuck on something. But just having that purpose driving you helps push through those walls and keep carrying you forward, because you know there's something great at the end of it.
Yes, and small emerging brands are, that is the bedrock of our economy and our economic ecosystem. Uh, Small emerging brands are the ones that are making, shaping the future of what's happening in this country. And what, you know, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, it's really about, being an advocate for consumers, for our fans, the lovers of what we do, and being able to offer more options, more sustainable options, more responsible options to consumers to consider when they're shopping. But I think it's important when you're a small emerging brand to understand this is going to be, you have to be battle ready, because essentially the industry, you could say wittingly or unwittingly, is conspiring against you. The system does not want small disruptors. It just wants to make it easier for these other brands that have already experienced a certain level of scale and success, and you know, those brands, those corporations are beholden to their shareholders, and making sure that they look good on their quarterly reports. And we're here to challenge that entire system. So that is like a David and Goliath story, kind of like at a multiple of 10x. So you have to be ready. Um, it's not easy, and it's not automatic, and a lot of it has to do with relationships and who you know. But you have to be willing to knock on doors, not just once, but 60 to 100 times to get somebody to open the door. And the COVID climate as an overlay is just creating greater challenge to that whole environment. So you have to be super driven, and I think have a fair amount of humility, because there's no one of us that really has enough, I guess, capabilities and institutional knowledge and understanding to be able to navigate through any of this very swiftly. Regardless of how much experience you have, it's challenging. And then, at the end of the day, if the consumer doesn't like what you have or isn't in love with it, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note too, anyone listening who's in this industry and growing a brand and wanting to learn from others and try to get further faster together, come join our free online community at community.evolvecpg. But with that said, thank you, Paul, for coming on and sharing your story and some of your wisdom. I imagine we could geek out on so many of the subjects we touched on for hours, so we might just have to have you back on to dive in some more rabbit holes. But appreciate you coming on, sharing your story, fighting the good fight for Cascara and upcycling and all the good things that you're doing. So keep rocking that out, and we'll point people to all your different social media profiles and website and so on and so forth in the show notes. But thank you again for doing what you do and coming out and sharing your story.
No, I really loved it, Gage. It's really good to get to know you, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this and have a conversation. And then B, thank you so much for your efforts to create, an environment, a community around CPG brands, to help foster greater viability and to inspire all those that are part of the community. So I really appreciate it. People like yourself who are wanting to help elevate brands such as Riff and give them a better shot and some, a little bit of unfair advantage. So thank you so much for all that you do.
Awesome. Well, cheers. Till next time. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Paul or his company, go to letsriff.com. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube channel for more innovator interviews, expert advice, and leadership discussions. If you like this episode, leave a heart, thumbs up, or review and share it with your colleagues. As an ever-evolving show, we also love feedback, so send us your thoughts or ideas for who we should talk to next to evolve@modernspecies.com.